Today, President Obama rolled out his nearly $4 trillion budget. It accesses more than $1 trillion from federal programs over the next 10 years. Well, does it get the job done? And will it satisfy Republicans? Those are the questions we have to answer tonight. First, let's look at the numbers. He has cut $200 billion over the next 2 years. $200 billion in savings. That's got to do it, right? That's a huge amount to cut. Well, as it turns out, again, let's do math. I like math on this program. As you remember, they just had an $858 billion in tax cuts over the next 2 years. So when you subtract the $200 billion that they just cut from the $858 billion in tax cuts, well, you've got $658 billion to go, and you still haven't made it up. So what I'm telling you is, these cuts that he's doing, whether it's Obama or it's the Republicans, it's not putting a dent in the budget because of the giant tax cuts. We keep focusing on the wrong problem. Let me prove it to you without a shadow of a doubt. The projected deficit in 2011 is $1.6 trillion. The whole non-defense discretionary spending budget in 2010 was $477 billion. Do you know what that means? That means that if you took non-defense discretionary spending, okay, all of it, wiped it out to zero, that's it, we cut everything outside of defense, you would still have a deficit that was over $1.1 trillion. You can't cut your way to doing this. It's so obvious. But that didn't deter President Obama. He's going to put these things on the chopping block. Let me give you examples. $300 million for community block grants. I thought he was a community organizer, but when it comes time to cutting the budget like the Republicans want him to, they go under the bus. And how about $2.5 billion cut from low-income home energy assistance program? Yeah, poor people don't need heat in the middle of the winter. And $400 billion from 5-year domestic spending freeze, that also gets cut. Look, when you add all these up, it still doesn't come close to the tax cuts for the rich that they just gave them. What drives me crazy is that no one in Washington cares. You're like, wait, look, you can't argue with the numbers. There's not a person in the world that can argue with those numbers. But they're like, I don't care. No, spending cuts, that's the way to go. Let's hit the rich. I'm sorry, that would be awesome if they actually shared the pain with all of us, middle class, poor, rich, if we did that. No, they hit the poor, they hit the middle class. Look, let me give you another problem with this, which is the framing, right? So Obama agrees to the GOP framing. Give tax cuts to the rich to help the economy. But that doesn't help the economy. Then cut programs for the middle class and the poor to balance the budget. But you can't balance the budget that way. All you're doing is helping them. Now, for all of his efforts, is Obama at least going to say, all right, Republicans come out and say, okay, oh, finally, he cut the spending exactly like we told him to. Let's give him credit. You think that's what's going to happen? Of course not. Republican House Leader Eric Cantor says today, quote, the president missed a unique opportunity to provide real leadership. Republican Budget Chair Paul Ryan says, quote, in this critical test of leadership, the president has failed. How about Republican Study Committee Chair Jim Jordan? He says the president failed a crucial test of leadership. How about John Corner from the Senate? He's the National Republican Senate Committee Chair. He says, quote, President Obama's timid budget proposal represents a missed opportunity to lead. How'd that work out for you, President Obama? Did you get them on your side? It doesn't look like it, right? You cut the heating for the poor. You cut programs for the middle class. I didn't even tell you about the Pell Grants that he cut a little bit. Graduate school loans, he cut a little bit. Cut, including community access. And what did you get? Nothing. But I'll tell you what the downside of all this is. You're moving the spectrum to the right. Now, let me show it to you in football terms. We did a fun little graph here. See, there's theoretically Obama on the left, the Republicans on the right. That's where they start out, and that's where the center is. But when Obama does a preemptive surrender, depending on how you want to frame it, I frame it that way, and says, I will give you these programs right from the beginning, he moves to the right. But the Republicans don't move towards the center to him. They say, fantastic, thank you for the moving to the right. We'll also move right. And now look at where the center is. It's closer to the hard right end zone. They're about to score, and Obama doesn't get it. Now, you see where I stand on this. Let's talk to some others now. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Earl Blumenauer of Oregon. He sits on the House Budget Committee. Congressman, look, I want to talk about the Republicans in a second, but I got to start with President Obama. Do you think it's a great idea to do these budget cuts here and start giving in to Republicans who don't give you anything back?
Well, I personally think that some of the reductions that the president has proposed are not priorities that I would push. I do give him credit for focusing on the need to keep going with health care reform, which is the largest source of our budget deficit in the future, and retaining the commitment to rebuild and renew America, putting Americans to work, revitalizing our communities. But you were right at the top. If we are going to not deal with health care reform, and if we're not going to deal with the fact that these tax cuts actually significantly increased the deficit, we're going to be chasing our tails. We should be reforming the tax system, not extending the tax cuts.
Congressman Blumenauer, is there any effort by the Democrats, whether it's in the House, the Senate, I know there isn't in the White House, but to say, hey, you know what? We'll talk about cuts, and that's a fair discussion. Sometimes you need cuts to balance the budget. Of course, everybody gets that. That's reasonable, right? But you have to talk about tax cuts for the rich. If you don't give back some of the money that they just took, well, we're not going to talk about cuts. So quid pro quo. You either put up or you shut up. Is there a movement like that among the Democrats or none whatsoever?
Well, there were a number of us, as you know, that voted against the extension of the tax cuts at the end of the last Congress. It's going to be on the table very quickly. The Republicans are going to be continuing to push ahead with this, along with their crazy ideas about conditioning increasing the debt limit with draconian elements. We're going to be in the middle of this over the course of the next 2 years. I agree with you. We need to have tax reform. The last thing we need to do is to extend tax cuts for people who need them the least. But we also need to continue with the rebuilding and renewing America and accelerating health care reform, not trying to eliminate it.
Congressman Blumenauer, let me get more specific. You know, there's, to President Obama's credit and to the Democrats' credit, they want to take away oil subsidies, or some of them do. Some of the Democrats don't, but a lot of them do. They want to take away the subsidies that goes $36 billion over the next 10 years. That's a giant number, right? So how about, again, we've been, throughout the segment, we've been talking about the 2-year time period. So that'd be a little over $7 billion that they would save. Now, the Republicans say, no, I need to give it to the oil companies because I'm going to cut from the poor, I'm going to cut from the middle class, but I got to give it to my oil company friends. Can't the Democrats at least take a stand and go, that's it. We're not going to give you a dime of cuts until you cut those oil subsidies for the richest companies in the world?
Well, as you may know, last week I introduced legislation that would do just that. In fact, it would cut over $40 billion over the next 5 years. Many of those are embedded in the president's budget. I think we ought to stand up and fight for them. We ought to spotlight the fact that the Republicans won't allow tax loophole closing to count towards deficit reduction, but just because those are their rather silly rules doesn't mean we shouldn't push ahead and try and do it.
Congressman Blumenauer, I agree with your bill, but you guys got to draw the line. If you don't draw the line and say we are not doing a single cut until you agree to that, you're going to get rolled over. I mean, I don't know if the White House understands that. I don't know if the Democrats in Congress understand that. I mean, my guess is I have to be honest with you. I think that you guys aren't going to insist on it. And when you don't, you're not going to win.
Well, we're involved with sort of an elaborate four-way discussion here. We've got the Republicans in the House who are proposing draconian, ideologically driven massive cuts. We have a proposal from the president. We're going to be pushing back on the House Budget Committee for Democrats, and we're going to have to be working with the Senate. I'm convinced that if we are aggressive in terms of tax justice, in terms of being sensible in the reductions in areas like the military, like areas of agricultural reform, and accelerating health care reform, I think there's a path that the American public will agree with.
All right, Congressman Blumenauer, thank you so much for your time tonight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Joining me now is Katrina vanden. She's the editor of Nation magazine. And Katrina, I want to start by asking you this. Are the initial concessions by President Obama before the negotiations even begin, is that a mistake?
I think we've seen time and time again a president preemptively making concessions that abet his opponents and demoralize his supporters. Compromise is demanded in politics, but leadership cannot be defined by compromise. This president was played a good hand in many ways, and I'm thinking back to the end of last year on the tax cuts. The preemptive concessions there took away his good hand, and he had on his side public opinion, but you can't just let that sit there. You have to mobilize public opinion with your leadership. Listen, our system in many ways is rigged through the power of establishment money, through the lobbyists that swamp D.C. every day. But on the other hand, you can provide leadership that lays out a different narrative. Cenk, we're having this debate about the budget. Completely wrong frame, skewed priorities. A budget is not just a set of numbers. It's a moral document. It is also a reflection of a nation's values and aspirations. And if we're a nation that is going to balance a budget on the back of the working class and low-income Americans to the benefit of the richest, to the multinational companies which offshore jobs, then we are a nation different than what we're seeing in the Middle East, but we are a nation in dire need of our own pro-democracy movement to take back this country for the people who have built it, who have made it strong, take it away from those who brought us the financial crisis, which robbed trillions from people who have worked so hard over these last decades.
All right, Katrina, here's the main thing I want to ask, right? Because we got to understand what the heck is going on inside the White House, right?
Do we?
Because
I think we need to understand, Cenk, what we're going to do outside of the White House, outside of D.C. It is late for that. We need independent organizing in this country to change the balance of forces, to change the nature of political power, and to find a way to have a different debate. Because the president, with all due respect, great cuts to big oil. The National Infrastructure Bank is a good thing, but this president is not going to lead us to the promised land.
Okay, I understand that, and I 100% agree with you. Don't get me wrong. Definitely get into the square, get wherever you got to do, because these guys aren't listening to us. They're cutting for the middle class, and they're giving it to the rich. They keep doing it over and over. I get that. But in your mind, is the president even understand this? Because I think it's, of course, important for us to understand the Democratic president that we elected, if he is on our side or not. So, I mean, does he get all this and go, I don't give a damn, I'm just going to do this because I look more centrist to my Washington friends?
You know what?
Or he just is flummoxed by it. He's like, oh my God, I'm giving into Republican framing? I didn't know that.
I do not believe a president who fought this hard to get to the White House is flummoxed. He is an intensely intelligent man. Listen, we have a blueprint of cruelty in the GOP plan. Let us not forget that. They didn't have a mandate to do what they're doing. It was about a lousy economy and joblessness, not desire for big spending cuts that put them in 2010 the way that they were put in. But this president is now seeking re-election in 2012, and this president is charting his own course. It is a course which sadly has demobilized a base which helped elect him to the White House. And so I think at the end of the day, we need to lay out alternatives. You spoke earlier. It is insanity that we have this military spending, 58% of the discretionary spending budget, and we have alternatives. Barney Frank and Ron Paul, if everyone is always seeking bipartisanship, laid out a good plan. By 2020, cuts nearly $1 trillion. $78 billion ain't going to do it over 5 years. And we have, in inflation-adjusted terms, a military budget that is larger than during the Bush years of the Cold War. This is insanity. And 2 wars costing about $120 billion a year. We can do better, but it's going to require people outside of Washington working with allies inside. Cenk, you said earlier, no one in D.C. cares. There are allies inside this Congress, and we can ally with them to say, hey, enough. There is a disconnect between what is going on in Washington and what this country needs.
Absolutely. And by the way, later in the program, we're going to have a Ron Paul supporter on here, and we're going to see if we can find true bipartisanship. What's wrong with the Republican Party? Can they fix it from the right? Can we fix it from the left? Can we all get together in the middle, the real middle of the country, not the fake middle of Washington?
Redefine the center is what is important, because I don't think what is called center in Washington is the true center of this, the compass of this country.
Absolutely right. Katrina vanden Heuvel, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.